EnergyCentral PowerSession entitled SEC Cybersecurity Regulations, Implementation and Guidance. Before we get started, I'd like to take just a moment to thank the sponsor of today's event, Nozomi, for making our event possible. Thank you very much. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to our moderator, Dick Brooks, co-founder and lead software engineer. Dick, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Oh, thank you, PJ, and thanks for organizing everything. So let's go ahead and get started. We have a lot to cover. Let's start with some introductions. So Danielle, would you like to lead us off?
Sure. Thanks, Dick. And thanks for everyone joining us today, just ahead of the holidays. And I'm really honored to be a part of this esteemed panel with these gentlemen today. My name is Danielle Jablansky. I'm an OT cybersecurity strategist with Nozomi Networks. I work horizontally, both internally and externally at Nozomi, to drive research and awareness, industry collaboration, and government relations for operational technology and industrial control systems cybersecurity.
Thank you, Danielle. And now we'll move on to Chuck.
Thank you, Dick. It's great to be here and be part of this great panel, and especially to talk about this very timely topic. My name is Chuck Brooks. I'm president of Brooks Consulting International. I also teach at Georgetown University Cybersecurity Risk Management, and I'm a Forbes featured writer on cybersecurity and technology, and served in government at DHS and on the Hill for most of my career, but also in the private sector at some of the defense contractors, and it's great to be here.
Thank you, Chuck. And Jim, you're up next.
Thank you, Dick. Thank you, Danielle and Nozomi. My name is Jim Hempstead. I'm a managing director at Moody's Investor Service. We're a global credit rating agency, and I manage the global project and infrastructure finance team, where we provide ratings on just under 2,000 different issuers of debt across the globe in the electric, gas, water sector, and some transportation sectors like airports, toll roads, and seaports, and other all kinds of project financings that you can imagine. And as an alumni of Villanova University, I often enjoy watching us beat Georgetown University in most sports. There you go,
Yeah, we need Patrick Ewing back.
And Bob, we'll hand it over to you with that one.
Yeah, thanks, Dick, and thank you as well, Danielle and Nozomi Networks. Great to be here with everybody. Bob Zukas, based here in LA. I lead an organization called Digital Directors Network. My background, I'm a retired PwC management consulting partner, a recovering professor from USC Marshall's School of Business, and DDN was formed 7 years ago to really advance the practice and profession of digital and cybersecurity risk oversight around the world. So we're the leading really advocate and policy shaper on these issues at the corporate governance level.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you to all of our esteemed panelists. We are really fortunate to have some incredibly talented people here with us today. So thank you all for joining us. And I think we have over 200 people registered. So it really does speak to the quality of the people we have sharing their knowledge here today. So thank you all. Let's go ahead and get started. Fro, let's start with question one. Could someone please provide a high-level overview of what the SEC Cybersecurity Regulations now require?
So I'll kick it off, and we could spend 90 minutes reading this regulation to you. And of course, we promise not to do that. And so the kind of what's what today is that there's a lot to take into account as you plan for your compliance strategies with this new SEC Rule 17 expansion. The rule requires, of course, registrants to disclose material cybersecurity incidents that they experience on an annual basis and provide material information regarding their cybersecurity risk management strategy and governance. So some fast movers have already done so, and some of these are already publicly available for you to scrutinize and analyze. These new rules will require registrants to disclose some new items on their 8K, and that is any cybersecurity incident that they determine to be material, and they have to describe the materiality of that incident's nature, scope, and of course timing. And it's within 4 days after they determine that that is a material impact or reasonably likely to be a material impact on the registrant, right? Lots of jargon in the actual, the new rule, but this, like I said, this new form, it's the item 1.05 on Form 8K will be due 4 business days after you determine that a cybersecurity incident is material without unreasonable unreasonable delay, which isn't quite defined either. And you also might have the capability to delay disclosure if you determine that this disclosure would pose a substantial risk to national security or public safety. And obviously that would have to be determined with the United States Attorney General and disclosed to the SEC in that form. A couple more things before we turn it over to the rest of the juicy discussion is this disclosure should include, of course, material incidents and then the likely or anticipated impacts, but also I borrowed some notes from Bob. Those disclosures should include consideration of harm to reputation for the business, customer or vendor relationships, competitiveness, and the possibility of litigation or regulatory investigations by a U.S. entity or otherwise. The last thing I love is this quote from the SEC chair, Gary Gensler. He was quoted as saying, whether a company loses a factory in a fire or millions of files in a cybersecurity incident, it may be material to investors. Where I sit in the world thinking about cyber physical impacts and industrial control systems every day, when a factory, plant, warehouse, or facility is disrupted, destroyed, or degraded by a cybersecurity incident, you could have both happen. And so that's kind of what I care about all day long. But in general, you know, the requirement is out there. The process is described. However, there's not a ton of detail in terms of what you have to include in the risk management strategy and governance portions of the disclosures, right? We focused on materiality a lot over the last couple of weeks. So I'm really excited to hear from the rest of the guys on the panel today about what that might mean for each of them and their vantage point from their careers and experience and expertise on how to get this right and the best kind of guidance that we'll have from these my colleagues here today. So thanks.
Thank you, Danielle. Anyone else have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, Dick, well, I'll weigh in real quickly on that. Something I found really curious in the final disclosure rules, and it really stood out to me, was the request that you disclose how much of your cybersecurity processes are actually insourced versus outsourced. So are you using third parties or others to help with any of these processes? I find that curious because I'm not sure where that's going to go or what the implications of that or what their representation of including that represents. So if you outsource and you've got third parties helping you deal with the management issues of these issues, does that have a perception of higher, lower, better processes around these issues? But that's going to be a really interesting one, and I think management teams are going to rethink that issue in the context of where's the SEC really trying to get to on this issue, and how do how do reasonable investors view that information?
Yeah, great points, Bob. Anyone else?
Yeah, I would think that just in time for the holidays, these regulations, the first one goes in effect tomorrow, which is the cybersecurity risk management strategy requirement of filing, and the second is goes on the 18th for disclosure. So this is a very timely panel for that reason alone. But what Danielle just discussed, and I think is really pertinent because the materiality of everything is very opaque right now, and there's going to be a lot of give and take in the next few months with the SEC and comments and what works and what doesn't. So it's really a starting point, but it's important that every company realizes that there are requirements out there right now and they begin tomorrow.
Thank you. Jim, you have anything?
No, nothing to add, Dick.
All right, thank you. So let's move on. So here's the next thing people are asking is, what role is the SEC expecting from a board of directors to take with regard to overall cybersecurity governance?
Yeah, Jim, Dick, let me knock that one out. The biggest omission, kind of the biggest headline of the final rules was the SEC did not put in the final rules that boards should disclose whether they have a cyber expert in the room. And remember, that was just a disclosure requirement. It wouldn't have forced boards to have those capabilities and skills, but they left that on the cutting room table, which in my personal opinion, I think is an enormous mistake in strengthening the boardroom as a control on these issues. The final rules did address the boardroom and the board's role, but it's a bit of a passive approach. It's nowhere near as directive when compared to Sarbanes-Oxley 22 years ago. And I always like to remind people that, remember, it was only 22 years ago when it was a novel concept to have somebody in a boardroom who understood a financial statement. And that's the literal truth. And Sarbanes-Oxley forced that expertise into the boardroom. And so the SEC doesn't like to do that. They don't like to be too directive, but they had to be directive with Sarbanes-Oxley because the capital markets were at risk if you couldn't rely upon the scorecard. So they want boards to be engaged. There's clearly an expectation for boards to have some responsibility and engagement on this issue. They want a disclosure of the board's role and how they oversee risks from cybersecurity threats. They want boards to disclose where, from an organizational structure, cybersecurity resides. Practically right now, it's in the audit committee of most public companies. And I think boards do that because they don't know where else to put it. So the audit committee becomes the kitchen junk drawer of corporate governance. Let's just put it in that kitchen junk drawer and see what happens. I actually think that that's the worst place for it and the leading bad practice and organizational structure around that issue. And then they want a description of the processes in terms of how the board is informed about cybersecurity risks and incidents. So a bit of a passive approach from the SEC's view on forcing the boards to engage and to understand these issues at depth with the final rules.
Thank you, Bob. Anyone else? Okay, let's move on. So Danielle mentioned at the beginning about the materiality of cyber incidents. So the rule does require this information about materiality within or reporting a material cyber incident within 4 business days. So the question is, what does material mean? And when does the clock start ticking on the 4-day reporting requirement?
Dick, I'll take that one. Materiality is an interesting thing. Having been in the credit evaluation side for many infrastructure companies and utilities for the last 20 some odd years, we actually are adopting a view here at Moody's that most of the companies that we rate, the vast majority of them, they understand what material means. And material could have 2 different types of meanings. One is the quantitative meaning and one is the qualitative meaning. And so quantitatively, if you go into the accountant's department, the accounting department, they have a very clear view of what material is. And they often look at it as a percentage of assets or revenue or EBIT, or cash flow or income and things like that. But it could also mean different things from a qualitative perspective. And I think that's where it gets really interesting from a cyber incident reporting perspective, like what is material. So the chief financial officer might have a very different view from the chief information security officer, and they might have a different view from the general counsel. And so we think it's good that going forward, they're all going to need to sit down together and try to determine what materiality really means for their entity. And I think utilities are going to be looking at materiality very differently tomorrow than they do today, especially as they continue to invest in their system and their assets. This digitization of these systems creates a whole new avenue for things to happen to them. And so the question that we talk about here is, if you lose your customer billing system, is that material to an electric utility or a water utility? As long as everything else is still going on, it might. And so we think it's going to be very interesting to see how this works out going forward. We do a survey of all of our issuers and we ask them a series of cyber questions. And when it comes to regulated and self-regulated utilities, which includes some of the public power utilities and things like that, we don't see a big increase in the amount of IT infrastructure investing that they're doing to host their data on public clouds next year. Whereas, we compare all of these types of things to global banks, which we view as the leading sector when it comes to all things cyber security. Global banks are increasing their IT infrastructure onto the cloud by 3 times next year versus this year. And that half of the global banks might use multiple cloud providers versus a single cloud provider. So we're comparing and contrasting how utilities are framing up on what might be an incident for them and how might they determine that to be material. And we're comparing it against the banks to see if there's a lag or how big that lag might be. And on the clock, Dick, the 4-day requirement, we really do think that's as soon as you determine that it is, Now that's going to be really interesting, right? Because most of these cyber incidents, they've been in your system for a very long time before you figured it out. And then you have to figure out, what the incident actually entails, and that could take some time. So we think there's going to be there's a benefit of seeing the CISOs work more collaboratively and directly with the executive suite of these organizations. We think that's a great sign going forward in terms of making sure that this happens in a way that gets everybody a little bit more comfortable. I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Jim. Very insightful. Anyone else?
I think Jim's insight's spot on. I think one of the things that we have a clue to what they're looking for is a complaint against SolarWinds, which they said that disclosure was generic and hypothetical, and that's what it cannot be. And with the involvement of the CISO and IT and audit and legal, it needs to be both quantitative and qualitative. So I think SEC is basically saying that this can't be just a checkoff response and you're compliant. You need to really look deep into the issues, and I think Jim just covered that well.
Yeah. I just want to tie something Bob and Jim said together, which is back to materiality. When the rule was first, voted on and disclosed to the public, people thought that the 4-day time frame was from discovery, right? 4 days from discovery. And now we've had a lot of understanding that 4 days is when you determine it's material. But you shouldn't only have 4 days to understand what could be material, right? And so back to this long-standing 20-plus year background of financial analysts understanding what material looks like for each organization from a financial status, the exact same catalysts don't exist for cybersecurity. So that key thinking, that analysis, that needed to start weeks ago. And if you haven't started that portion, that's what needs to start today, tomorrow, and next week, which is understanding the exact catalyst that could trigger the similar financial impacts or worse impacts or safety impacts, right? Environmental impacts, operational impacts, those kinds of things. So don't take those 4 days from even discovery to say, wow, we really have to wrap our arms around that. We need to be rethinking risk registers, rethinking our analysis today. And I've heard from other folks in the industry for insurance that that's really, really difficult to do for cybersecurity because of what Bob said, which is there's a huge reliance on outsourced and third-party security solutions. So more often than not, when I'm doing consulting today, either for Nozomi or elsewhere, I'm asking people, if you are relying on a third party for your backups, are you checking what's in the backups? Are you verifying? Because that liability is still on you. And so that whole third-party conversation tied to what Jim said about materiality is what people should really be paying attention to when they're parsing through this language.
Yeah, and Daniel, the whole third party thing is such a can of worms, right? And so the SEC, and I love the fact that the SEC went there because it's actually forcing into leadership suites more systems thinking, concepts of systemic cyber risk and how we've created this distributed risk environment. Materiality, remember, it's an eye of the beholder test, right? So in the eye of the reasonable investor. And so, clearly if, stock price goes down 20% because of an incident, most rational people would say, yeah, a reasonable investor would think that that's pretty material. But what if there's a ransomware attack and ambulances and emergency services, ambulance are actually misrouted or rerouted away from the hospitals, which happened a couple of weeks ago, right? So what if there's an incident and it creates a loss of life? It's not quantitative at all, but it creates a life event or a life situation. Would a reasonable investor view the fact that your systems can essentially, if they go down, create loss of life as a material consideration in valuing and making an investment in your company? So it's going to take a rethink in the context of how reasonable investors view the impacts of these incidents, all from an IT and an OT perspective. And the OT side of this opens up, an entirely new dimension. And the key is the SEC with the disclosure rule, they don't like to be directive to issuers because issuers always complain and they moan about that, right? Don't tell us what, don't give us a 5% threshold. But when you don't give them a 5% threshold, they still complain, right? Because now they have to think about it. But that's what the SEC wants to do with the disclosure rule. Put a deliberative process in place. We want to force you to critically think about these incidents, their impact on value, and what that means from an investor's perspective, and have a process and have a story and make your determination based upon that. And that's really the standard, and that's where a lot of work has to be done. Still, we're pretty much at ground zero, I think, for most companies on having that deliberative process in place.
So Bob and Danielle, I think you both explained why SEC should reconsider having cybersecurity expertise as part of the board, or at least advising the board, because these are not issues that are typical for most companies. And cybersecurity is a world into its own.
Yeah, exactly, Chuck. Right. This isn't a risk like other risks. The details of these risks are very nuanced. The general governance community thinks this is a general business risk that any corporate director or any standard risk management process can articulate, can understand, and can govern. And I think that's wrong.
Hey, Bob, I really agree with that. We big fan of cyber security evaluation should be part of the existing risk management processes that everybody has. And that means, and forgive me, we need to convert the bits and bytes into dollars and cents. We need to convert the big data points into basis points and things like that, so that everyone they're fluent in their different languages. But I do believe that we're heading in the right direction with these regulations. This is the SEC regulations. There's other regulations globally that are coming as well. And whether or not, a lot of stuff that comes up is, well, what if there's over reporting? What if the 8K system gets flooded with these types of things? That's part of the process. And so that may or may not happen, but if it does happen, it'll quickly work its way out, because the investment community isn't going to tolerate a lot of that type of over disclosure that's really not saying anything for very long, right? So that they'll move in to fix that relatively quickly. So I think we're in a good spot.
Yeah, this is an excellent interchange. Thanks, everyone. So I want to pick up on something that Jim said earlier about larger utilities, and I think a Colonial Pipeline and their ransomware attack made headlines. So my next question is, what about large corporations? What are the key success factors in building effective cyber defense systems for them?
I'd be happy to take that. It could be a 90-minute session itself, but it really requires a risk management strategy, which most corporations have failed to enact, even a lot of the large ones, often after the fact, after they've been breached. But basically, it's really if you look at what the government's doing with zero trust right now, and looking internally and seeing what's connected to them, what devices, what people, who has access, that's a starting point. Most companies really are still victims of phishing, insider threats, others, because they really have no, visibility into who's there and who's not. Their IT shops often change, the people leave, and this makes it very difficult to keep yourself protected. So having a risk management strategy requires a lot of things. One of the things it does require is understanding what the threats are, threat vulnerability, knowing what the matrices are, knowing what we're facing now with artificial intelligence coming online, being used by criminal hacking gangs and by state sponsors, knowing what the Internet of Things threat now with all interconnected devices, and also training of your employees, having an incident response plan. Often companies have thought about cybersecurity as really just a cost item, and it's not a cost item, it's an operational imperative if you want to stay in business. Bigger companies realize this earlier, particularly like Target and Colonial Pipeline more recently, as the analogy says, but even they weren't aware. They didn't even have any basic compliance, and they weren't sure if it was an OT or IT issue, and they had no incident response plan. So that first strategy is really a starting point for every big company. They should have a security operations center if they're that big. I don't worry about the big companies so much. I worry about more of the small and the middle ones, because they're easier targets, and they don't have the resilience that large companies have. But the same process applies to everybody, and it starts with a strategy and knowing this. And there's a lot of frameworks to use from NIST, from MITRE, and others that can provide for industry specific, particularly with critical infrastructure and energy. There's specialized ones. So I think for any company, that's a starting point, and a lot of them are already doing it because of compliance issues, but compliance is not enough. It really is knowing now that we're in a new threat environment that is much more deadly and much more capable of inflicting harm than ever before.
Thank you, Chuck. Anyone else have something to say on this?
I think I jump in on.
Oh,
Go ahead, Bob.
Good.
Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, well, one quick comment with the Colonial Pipeline situation, when leadership makes a decision to shut their own system down, they're doing the work for the attackers for them. And it's an admission that they don't understand the risk environment that their company's operating in. So the whole OT environment is going to open up that can of worms, right? And we know through the work we've done and with the leaders that we engage with that we can understand risk and we can mitigate these issues. But if you put your leadership team in a position where their only options when the system starts to spiral out of control are to basically ignore the risk and let's just take our chances, or to pull their own plug, shut their own system down, both of those are failure points, right? That's a failure for leadership to understand risk and to be a strong control in the system. And the whole OT world is making that business shutdown situation a reality. We saw that in the gaming sector. We saw that with Colonial Pipelines. There is another option, and the other option is to actually understand systemic risk in these concepts at depth and don't set your leadership team up for failure.
Jim, you had something?
Many companies don't even have backup, and you would think even Colonial Pipeline, with the obvious threat of ransomware and the fact that they're being attacked by state-sponsored organizations, that you'd think they would have more concerns, but they have so far been neglecting that. Hopefully that'll change after SolarWinds and Colonial, but we'll see.
Jim, you have something for us?
Yeah, so thank you. I'd like to push back a little bit in the spirit of deliberation on this call, but Colonial is a very strategic pipeline, not easily replicated. And it's an investment grade, strong investment grade pipeline, given its leverage and its counterparties, et cetera. And it does have very deep pocketed owners. We viewed it a little differently. We thought maybe that was a sign that they did have a reasonable incident plan in place, that they very quickly shut the pipeline down in the interest of safety. And so when that event, the Colonial event, is where we as a firm decided that, okay, that is a wake-up call, because from a critical infrastructure perspective, we saw a blurring of the lines between the IT system and the OT system, where the IT system can turn off the OT system one way or another. Now you have other incidences where you have all kinds of pumps and valves and temperature readings and things like that are easily hackable, that could also provide misinformation to central dispatch. But that's not what we're talking about right now at this instant. So we did see that as a reasonable thing. There was no backup plan. Thank goodness they got it turned back on, when they did, because if it continued to go forward, I think that's where the knock-on effects would really come in. And that's where I think an area of focus should be pointed at, of the critical infrastructure that that makes all the systems work. You could count them on your hand, how many critical suppliers to the infrastructure, the electric, gas, water businesses that are the audience for this call. Those are key vendors and suppliers that represent very significant, concentration risk when it comes to this type of risk. But we thought that Colonial handled it very well. It was a wake-up call from a financial services community, and I just wanted to put that on the table.
As the resident OT ICS gal here, I won't stress this too much, but I do want to kind of pinpoint on something that Jim said, which is that transition between the IT and the OT is where we see the most OT attacks originating. However, in the Colonial instance, it was still a business decision, which was still a win for ICS targeted attacks, right? We didn't see any manipulation of the industrial control systems. Out of an abundance of caution is where we want to see the analysis that we've been talking about start today. Those terms of dependence and interdependence need to be ironed out, clearly articulated across the business, so that you can take actions from the business in an abundance of caution where you're not picking up the pieces from an unprecedented safety scenario. So I agree with both of you in that decision-making framework. It's just the interdependence and the dependence we need to start teasing out in new ways, because those two terms actually do mean different things. We might all be dependent on the same supplier for a single piece of infrastructure, and that's dependence, right? Critical dependence. And we also might require AWS services in certain sectors to, or a third party for interdependence. Something else may not work, period, if we don't have this available, right? Availability of key systems is huge. Not necessarily cloud providers, but that's a key factor across many sectors, more broadly speaking. And so it does not just only describe this IT/OT incidence in terms of unprecedented analysis, but this abundance of caution to underscore your critical interdependencies from a business to technology reliance perspective is something most companies have not scratched the surface on. And then they kind of look at the headlines or scenarios that are really unlikely, and they pick those on accident because they scare them, right? And we don't want to be scared, we want to be prepared.
Yeah, I think you hit exactly where the gap is, and it is between that. And with Colonial Pipeline, they really, it was an IT attack, but they didn't know. And so in the abundance of caution, they didn't have any plan in effect, so they had to turn down their OT, in my opinion, at least. But I think that, that this is a reality now, that these big organized state sponsors are using sophisticated methods, although that attack wasn't that sophisticated, but they have the capability now. And the real question now is, with DHS CISA, should critical infrastructure owners be solely responsible for protecting themselves when they're fighting against Russia and China and North Korea and Iran? Or should they have more involvement from the government taking a defensive role, more than just compliance and fining, but actually, using defensive measures and potentially using offensive measures to stop these threats? So that's a bigger issue and not part of this discussion with SEC, but it's an issue discussion going on with the Department of Homeland Security and government right now, because of the capabilities with artificial intelligence, with polymorphic malware and other things are very tough for most businesses to deal with, and they don't have the capacity or expertise to do it, and particularly with OT, where there's a very big shortage of people and workers in the area.
I won't foot stomp this too much, but I will say I can strongly underscore that Colonial Pipeline's OT networks were okay. That's all I'll say on that. But just if anyone's curious, they did a great job, and they should be proud of themselves for what they can mitigate on the OT side.
Good.
So I think what I'm hearing from all of you is that really cybersecurity is really a holistic problem, right? It can affect the company, but it can come from IT, it can come from OT, really can come from anywhere. So that's a good lead in to our next question. So Chuck mentioned smaller companies in one of his earlier descriptions. So my question really is, we heard what a large company should do. So what about smaller and medium-sized businesses? What should a company do to start the process to comply with these regulations, and how long will it take to prepare?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on this one just because we consistently always say in cybersecurity that it depends, and it's the worst answer, but it's always the most true, right? We've talked a little bit about the decision to not, force to disclose whether or not there's a cybersecurity expert on the board. Large enterprises and corporations can afford another expert. Small to medium-sized businesses maybe can't, or they would afford that expert and not be able to afford a product, tool, solution, or new process. So number one, have a process. The risk that Jim mentioned about the flooding of reporting, or the flooding of disclosures or 8Ks, et cetera, my other concern is that there now will be a public list, because if you remember the language I kind of rattled off earlier, a portion of that is to disclose your policies and strategies, comma, if any, comma. So if you don't have them, you're reporting on that as well. And we could actually produce a list of the less mature security policies for large enterprises out there that you could go and say, wait a minute, I have a target list here of less robust procedures. So that worries me. So have a process first and foremost. And then I think there's an audit to be had. Whether or not that's a compliance audit and enforced by a third party isn't the case anymore. Internally, we need to be conducting reviews of previous risk management priorities, strategies, and governance. We need to be doing the gap analysis to determine what's missing, what's working, what are the known issues we need to address, where have we documented them, and why haven't we fixed them, right? How do we prioritize? And then what are the working definitions that we've had for the last 5-10 years? Do those definitions still serve us? And are there frameworks out there and resources that might better serve us in terms of the risk and regulation landscape? And let's not wait for things to be completely enforceable for us to start adopting better practices and frameworks. Again, under existing case law, I'm pulling this from some notes Bob shared with me. information is deemed material if there's a substantial likelihood that a reasonable shareholder would consider it important. So that needs to go back into these conversations of dependence and interdependence. An example I like to use a lot is also a couple summers ago when Facebook experienced a large disruption, and their badging system for their manual doors, or not manual, their automatic doors, actually were impacted by this overreach of dependence on technology within their building facilities, something that they hadn't thought through, right? So these are the new contingencies we need to be preparing for. Again, it's an OT example, but it's one that just wasn't considered in their current risk posture, landscape, and understanding of cascading impacts. So we need to be able to prioritize based on operational environmental context, not just with OT, but with all of the cascading impacts. And rather than focusing on a means-based approach, I call it, we need to start focusing on an effects-based approach to cybersecurity. What's the worst case example that could happen here? Do we know that there's a cybersecurity catalyst for that scenario, right? It's not just a Hollywood plot. It can actually happen here. And it doesn't matter what capabilities a threat actor has and if and when they might choose you as their next target. It matters that you can actually reduce the severity of the impact you know is reasonably apparent as a risk profile for your own company. So beyond categorizing and prioritizing these external and internal external risks, we really need to reinvestigate downstream and upstream impacts, something we've all witnessed as a major lesson learned from some of the examples we've already mentioned, but also SolarWinds, of course, in the SEC context. And then where there are known risks, we need to be able to report those, disclose those, and attest that we're working on them, right? You don't have to be perfect. I think that's something we're missing in the conversation around this. Nobody's asking for companies to be perfect. We're asking you to do what you say you're doing, not we, but the community is saying, if you have a procedure in place, review that procedure. And if you think that procedure is right for your business, carry it out, right? And then lastly, because I am an OT person, I will say that there is this new reinvigorated discussion that Bob and others have mentioned around operational technology and, of course, operational risk. And at Nozomi, we've define that to mean any situation which could cause a loss of view or loss of control to your connected processes and functions where view and or control cannot be recovered automatically or remotely from manipulation. And that's borrowed from some literature out there, but that operational risk category is one that there's not a ton of literature around for businesses that are now newly reliant on automation and technology beyond the legacy systems we think of in terms of traditional industrial environments, right? It's all over the place. So connected buildings, et cetera, real estate, everyone's thinking about these things now.
Thank you, Danielle. Anyone else have anything on this?
On the issue of affordability, and if you reframe that discussion, this is actually one of the most efficient and cost-effective controls, having a cyber expert on a board for a company of any size. So S&P 500 directors make on average $315,000 a year. So if you're one of the 500 largest companies in the country, and you can materially strengthen a control, the board as a control, by having a cyber expert in the room for $315,000 a year, that's a fraction of what you spend on the corporate jet. Why wouldn't you do that? That's kind of a no-brainer. If you're a small to mid-cap public company, you pay your corporate directors $100,000 a year, $125,000 a year. If you can strengthen leadership as a cyber control in the system for $100,000 a year, it's a no-brainer. You do that all day long. If you're a private company, $1 billion private company, you're probably paying your directors a $60,000 a year retainer. We pay graduates out of USC Marshall more than that, fresh graduates. So if you can strengthen a control for $60,000 at the leadership level around cyber expertise, why wouldn't you? It's a no-brainer. It's one of the most effective controls you can put in place and most efficient controls you can put in place from a cost perspective. That's how I view it.
Very good.
And Dick, maybe if I could just tease that out a little bit farther. I mean, most of the big sophisticated infrastructure companies are not going to have too much trouble dealing with this. They already have systems in place. They're very good at dealing with regulations and preparedness. If you're an entity that needs these regulations to come by to bring you along, we do view the increased regulatory scrutiny as a credit positive because of the rising tide concept. But if you're needing these regulations to get you up to speed, you're lagging pretty far behind where you should probably be by now. From a suite of mitigation around cybersecurity and protecting your system. And the board is still, right, Bob, in charge of maintaining the integrity and value of the enterprise. And so we do kind of look at it that way. I don't know if it's a totally fair way to look at it, but that's kind of you know, what we think about that.
Okay, moving on. So one of my most valued colleagues is a fellow by the name of Joe Sullivan. He was a CISO at Uber. He's, as you know, he was in the news for a bit. So my next question has to do with CISOs. So how can a CISO prepare themselves to be ready to engage with the board? Are there any training programs available to them?
Yeah, Dick, and I'll take this one. We created the first masterclass on this issue 7 years ago, and we've got it's a who's who of CISOs from major airlines, CIOs from some of the major sports leagues, the CDC that have stepped up to this leadership moment. And what we're teaching is how they actually, what governance is about. And we're teaching concepts of systemic cyber risk and how they actually need to tell the story to the boardroom. So yeah, there is help available out there. There's not an enormous portfolio of classes that they can go to. There's general governance stuff out there, but it's not targeted to the IT or the cyber executive to help them succeed with their own board or actually start their journey as a corporate director, because many boards are not following the SEC's lead. They're doing what they think they should do and still adding these skills and capabilities to the boardroom. So they're still looking for these people. So yeah, give us a kudo for being early to that issue and seeing the eventuality of where we would get to here. But I would encourage any CIO or CISO to recognize this as a leadership opportunity. This is a leadership moment. This is our chance to step up and redefine the value that we deliver to the organization and to take that value proposition to the other side of the boardroom table and to help lead our companies safely and securely into the digital future.
I'm glad you're doing that, because I think the CISO role has evolved so much in the last few years, and it's gone so far beyond just a technical role. It really requires soft skills, requires understanding of how to deal with the company mechanisms, and they really should be part of the C-suite. And most companies are still not, but the CISO has really transcended into a different meeting than it was a couple years ago, and it's exciting to see you doing that.
I'm glad you called it a leadership opportunity, and I just want to mention that it's not happening in a vacuum. So the secure by design transition and conversation, also a leadership opportunity. Some people have shied away from that, thinking it's a vendor technical conversation. It's not. It's a leadership opportunity to do better in the market, to set yourself apart, to set a new standard, right? At the same time that CISOs and the SEC are saying, here's a leadership opportunity. At the same time that in Europe, we see the Cyber Resiliency Act, which has some flaws, I'll be honest, but also it's a leadership opportunity to do better, to set new standards. To Jim's point about rising tides, sure, a storm can also rise a tide, but let's not wait for the storm, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's also a liability opportunity, as we found out with Tim Brown. So I think that's also a consideration now that has really come into play too, for who wants to assume that kind of liability unless you're given enough protection and enough support. And most CISOs don't have enough support or enough of a team to operate in the majority of the companies I've looked at.
Well, this is very insightful, and I know that I mentioned I've spoken several times with Joe Sullivan about some of these concepts, and he makes essentially the same point that you folks are making. That is, this is an opportunity now for CISOs. This is not the time to run away. So it's nice to hear everyone seems to be on that same page. So moving on. So one thing we do know, and Chuck just mentioned this as well, and we talk about coverage and cyber insurance. So many companies depend on cyber insurance to mitigate against cyber risks. Will the new rules have any impact on cyber insurance coverage?
Who's going to take this question?
I'll go first if that's okay. Yeah, of course. Every time there's something new coming around, the insurance industry is going to, take a look at it and figure out how to properly maintain what they're covering and their margins and things like that. The companies can prepare for dealing with their insurance when the renewals come up, about answering some questions about how they're going to adopt these issues. They're going to answer some questions about, the D&O liability, the director and officer liability policies and things like that, and highlight the communication that's happening amongst the executives and the tech team and the cyber professionals, because they're going to be asking, they ask already very intrusive and exhaustive sets of questions around this. And so as the playing field starts to recalibrate under the new regulations, the insurance industry, of course, will also recalibrate along those lines. And the reliance on cyber insurance is pretty good in the sector. I mentioned the survey that we do of our global issuers, which we're very happy about. 2,000 different entities, answered the survey, which we think is a pretty big survey. But 73% of banks, again, which we think are the leading sector when it comes to this, maintain standalone cyber insurance. 64% of the electric and gas transmission and distribution utilities maintain standalone cyber insurance. This is how they answered the question. 50% for water and wastewater, and 43% for the unregulated utilities and power companies. So there's a heavy European and international flavor in that particular instance, and that's very consistent with what we see. North America, very high adoption of cyber standalone insurance. Europe, less so. Asia, less so. And so we think that as the insurance industry looks to mitigate their exposure under standalone cyber insurance issues, they're gonna dig in deeply to make sure that they're keeping everybody's feet to the fire in terms of what you're supposed to be doing to get the coverage that's being offered.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I would just raise on cyber insurance, recognize that only about based upon our calculations, only about 8 to 10% of the economic exposure of cyber risk has been transferred to the insurance industry. So companies are largely self-insured. And what's unique about cyber insurance is you're actually self-insured for the catastrophic, unlike other areas in your life that you insure. If I get hit by a bus, loss of life, I'm insured. My house burns down, I'm insured. You're self-insured for the catastrophic and cybersecurity risk. It's the first layer of risk that you've transferred to the risk transfer industry. So your best approach is self-insurance, which is largely what you're doing anyway. So focusing on those controls and how you're mitigating your own risk environment is the strategic, thoughtful approach to this issue.
Okay, sounds great. So I know that the CEO of MGM talked a little bit about their own costs associated with their cyber incident. They're looking at over $100 million, and they're thinking their cyber insurance will cover it. Of course, they did mention the potential for a rise in premiums next year, so there's a side effect to that. So Bob, with regard to these board members that you mentioned, would you have any advice to them with regard to this cybersecurity? I mean, they could be subject to these cyber mark case or care mark cases as well, right?
Yeah, what's interesting is as we see a body of regulation and standards evolve in an issue, the Caremark standard actually comes down. So director liability actually starts to increase the more that there's actually a regulatory framework on a particular issue. It's still a pretty high bar for directors to be held personally liable, but my advice is really encapsulated in the phrase, don't go to your plumber for dental work. Recognize that these risks are unique, and you need the expertise in the room to understand these risks and strengthen the board as a control. Make sure somebody has your back as a fellow corporate director, and make sure you've got, frankly, management's back on these issues, because you're part of that team and that system from a cybersecurity perspective.
Excellent. Anyone else? Okay, so it looks like board members have their own risks to be concerned about as well. And so the next one would be, what advice would you give to directors and officers regarding the new rules?
Well, I think, similar to what Bob was just saying, I mean, you have to understand the liability issues involved. but also I think it generates a need for a better understanding of the cyber ecosystem, knowing what the threat environment is, knowing what your other people in the industry are doing, knowing what are the basic frameworks out there, as no industry is generic, depending also upon your size and your mission, what you're doing. So I think directors need to be more sophisticated in terms of understanding cybersecurity, and that's where I keep going back to what Bob was just saying. You really need the outside help, because it really is a specialized area, and there's just not enough people in it, and particularly when you're talking about operational technology. So I think that's my word is just get knowledgeable.
Yeah.
And Dick, if I could just jump in on that, beware of falling into a culture of compliance. This is an area that I think a lot of people are on guard for, but especially when you're trying to allocate and deploy precious capital dollars, it's sometimes easier to fall back and say, well, let's deploy those capital dollars into something that helps me check a box from a compliance perspective, but it might not be the biggest bang for your investment dollar that you could otherwise get from a protection and a security and a defensive and a resiliency type of result. And I think that's very important that we stand on guard for that, especially at the board of directors.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, and Dick, I would add, whenever you talk directors and officers, what pops into people's heads is, do I have D&O insurance if you're a CISO, right? And there's kind of 3 layers to that. We did a nice webinar with Marsh a couple of weeks ago. It's available on the DDN LinkedIn page if you want to read it, but demystifying that. And it's kind of like an Oreo cookie. The first layer of the cookie, if you're an officer, a legal officer of the company, yes, you're covered by D&O. Most CISOs are not officers of the company. Most CIOs are not officers of the company. The middle, the white stuff, like, what is that? What is that white stuff? It's just some kind of weird white stuff. You might be actually covered by the D&O policy if you're not actually a legal officer. It depends on the facts and circumstances. Then the bottom of the cookie is an indemnity. You might have an indemnity. If you don't have an indemnity, you need an indemnity. And Marsh is working with the insurance industry to standardize that indemnity in the context of these issues for CIOs and CISOs. But the lesson in there for executives is your company has cyber insurance. They've transferred risk. Make sure you're not self-insured for this issue, and you've got some risk transfer in place as well. And there's 3 layers of possible protection to that issue, and it's an Oreo cookie.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I would just agree. After SolarWinds and Clorox and others, I mean, it's almost an imperative for a CISO to have some sort of insurance and protection, because everyone's a target, and it doesn't matter if you think you're not part of the C-suite, but they're going to go after you. And I think these new SEC disclosure rules, and even though they're sort of general right now, I think that sort of opens the door for more of a need for liability insurance for people involved in putting together the risk management strategy. Because if it's incomplete, they may be the ones that are penalized.
Yeah, and Tim Brown was not an officer of SolarWinds, and he's still there. He's still the CISO. He was not an officer, but they have an indemnity in place for him, and they're covering his legal fees, right, which is really what you care about on this stuff, right? So they took care of that issue for him.
Yeah. And Bob, I have to say, I attended that Marsh presentation. It was outstanding. So very insightful. Anyone who gets a chance to see it should take the few minutes. It's not very long. The next question is, sort of relates to this, is what are the typical mistakes that companies make when implementing their cyber defense programs?
I think I'll jump in. I think they often think that they need the latest and greatest device. They tend to, most companies have upwards of 35 to 50 different security systems for cyber. They don't know how to orchestrate them. They just keep buying them and adding them. I think that's part of the mystique of cybersecurity and the lack of expertise in a lot of companies. Also, I think they go exactly what the problem with SEC is before, is the generic approaches. They think that a risk management approach for their company is just something that they could read out of a book and follow, when every company has a unique culture, unique requirements, unique products and missions. So I think nothing could be really generic when it comes to that. And I think that I think that there's also not enough focused on retention of talent. It's a real problem first to get the talent, but there's a lack of planning in a lot of companies. What happens when some of the key IT people or cyber people leave, and they're often left with huge gaps. And this is pretty common. And I know it's unfortunate there's just not enough people, but you need to plan for that too.
Jim mentioned a culture of compliance. I think that's a great call out, but also what we see really commonly is silos, lack of communication, lack of documentation, right? I said yesterday on a show that security should be boring. And kind of like Chuck said, this focus on larger than life solutions is one thing, but also there's a focus on larger than life tactics. And you might hear of a new threat actor that's described and developed this piece of malware that could definitely impact you, but at the same time you have 16 misconfigured firewalls. What are you doing in terms of that update, that documentation, that kind of nimble daily security maintenance and management and documentation and communication, right? It's that kind of day-to-day interval, success that's really going to set you apart from I've also said this: be a less attractive target, right? Even if you can associate the capabilities of potential malware in your organization, make yourself a less attractive target, right?
All right. Well, I will say that I've worked with the energy industry since about 1990, so I know that every one of them takes all of these concerns very seriously. And so I'd like to take just a moment to ask, many companies in the energy industry are operating critical infrastructure. And I know that a large chunk of my own compensation was based on a bonus. And if we had a blackout, there goes the bonus, right? So what advice would you give to directors and officers to comply with the new rules with regard to their ICS and OT operations?
Yeah, well, first of all, shout out to the operators. I mean, they're probably not the directors and officers that we're speaking to on this question, but shout out to the operators, the people that put in the hours, the people that are gearing up for the holiday season, knowing that they might miss some time with their families. And thank you for that. Critical infrastructure, unfortunately, has become a catch-all term, and it again is really difficult to prioritize. But I think even this discussion around individual coverage and liability transfer and all of those things, even if you're covered individually, you have skin in the game when it comes to these companies. You want them to succeed. And I think success is all about tolerance when it comes to cybersecurity. So earlier when I said, where do you start? I said, let's reevaluate the gap analysis that we need to understand, the interdependencies, the technological dependence. But tolerance is really what makes the difference in how you respond to something that does happen, right? And one caveat that people don't like to hear that matters is egos. So when I give conversations and talks around incident response, there's a lot of egos in the room, and you have to be able to check your ego at the door, understand the tolerance, how long you can handle a disruption, how long you can have services down, how long can you manage that mean time to recover before it is catastrophic. And I tell people, you cannot prepare for every contingency in the world of cybersecurity. You can prepare to have the best catastrophe possible, right? That sounds not good, but it really can be a benefit to you. So I think everyone has something to learn, first of all. Second, I think we need to involve more stakeholders. So back to this lack of communication and documentation, it's compliance and legal, it's insurance, it's the CFO, it's people managers or HR, your investor and corporate relations, all of the stakeholders that you would want to incorporate into a tabletop or an incident response, incorporate them into this conversation around your disclosure, your strategy and what you put on paper. Somebody referenced the Texas hospital incidents. We were writing that exact incidents into tabletops 5 years ago about diverting patients, not having access to medical records to do emergency surgeries, what that looks like, what are your transportation routes. That's the same type of emergency planning that goes into hurricane planning. If you operate these critical infrastructure locations, reach out to FEMA, reach out to your governors and see what kind of emergency planning and preparedness they have. Have they thought about cyber? Have you talked to those stakeholders, right? It's a big conversation, but we need to shift that. For decades, we talked about boards wanting to mitigate risk, and they would assign leaders in their organizations to actually avoid risk. And we're flipping that script. If you want to avoid risk today as a board member, you need to enable your teams to mitigate that risk every single day. And when you're mitigating risk, you're not avoiding or eliminating hazards, you're understanding that at the end of the day, things are likely going to happen, and you've got to be able to respond in a timely manner and say, we prepared for this. And then, on operational technology and process control systems, at the end of the day, very niche, right? Operations with these components that were not originally, designed to be accessible to the internet, they're not insecure by design because they're designed to be insecure. Okay, they're designed to function, and they're designed for a purpose, and that mission critical purpose is what you should focus on if you know that mission, right? So if you're building a conversation around, your actual control systems and that process side of the house, you need to understand the mission, right? And if people in your organization don't understand the mission of the technology and the functions, help them understand it, right? Don't discredit them from the conversation because they're not there yet. Bring them along. And somebody else mentioned visibility. If we got really into the weeds, I'd say visibility matters, of course, but it's not the starting point. There's a lot of other things we've covered. And then it's a little cheesy, but I'll say it anyway. Be the catalyst. Stop waiting for an incident or a forcing mechanism or a new piece of legislation or a new piece of compliance. Be the catalyst within your organization or within your board to have that tolerance conversation and to mature your own due diligence.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, it's interesting because there's some business functions that don't necessarily think of ICS and OT as being part of their world. Like, for example, banks, for example, don't think of ATM networks as ICS and OT, but I think many of them would be considered that. Would you agree, DJ?
Banks, car washes, bridges, prisons. Prison is one that I do in my my independent research that is not considered a critical infrastructure sector, but it should be, right? It's part of it. Space is this whole conversation, right? It's everything.
Yeah. So a lot of what we see today is, within the cybersecurity space, people think of it as an IT function, right? It's just the status quo seems to be, password changes and resets and account deletions and additions. Those are all just pure IT functions. And the question really is, as we start to look at this more broadly, are we witnessing a paradigm shift in how companies will view and manage cyber risk as business risks now that the SEC regulations are taking effect?
Yeah, Dick, if I could jump in on that, absolutely. The implementation of these SEC rules and regulations in and of itself signifies a paradigm shift for how these companies need to perceive and manage cyber risks. And it goes to show that it needs to be looked at on a more holistic, integrated assessment as opposed to just an IT problem. And the IT aspect of cyber, that applies to a lot of different sectors where that's important to them. Moody's is a global financial services company. It's very important to us, right? Our risk factors highlight the need to protect the private information that we have on all of our customers and things like that. But when you get into the infrastructure business, and I'm talking about the electric, gas, and water systems, midstream, chemical factories and transportation systems and communication systems, it gets into the operations very quickly. And I think it's important because as those systems upgrade their assets, and they're all upgrading their assets, the CapEx for the utility sector, for example, is up significantly up and to the right over the next couple of years is the projections. That brings with it a whole vast new set of behaviors for those assets on how they're going to work. And to Danielle's commentary just a little while ago, there's utilities that are out there right now that 7-10 years ago, they built data centers to store all their data. They didn't know why they were storing it all, but they knew one day it was going to be important. And so many of them made those types of investments. And this paradigm shift is really coming at an important time for everyone, given the energy transition that's going on right now and the need to decarbonize the power grid and the need to make mobility more efficient and things like that. And putting people in the room, the different stakeholders that Danielle was just talking about is, I wrote that down like 3 times and underscored it. That's the paradigm shift right there, because you've got a bunch of different people that are all going to be speaking the same language. It's going to take some time. There'll be bumps in the road, but that shift is moving in that direction, and increased regulatory scrutiny is going to be here with us to stay, for quite some time. Not that dissimilar to the way it was on environmental increased scrutiny out of the EPA and things like that from 20 years ago. But this is the shift that's underway. I think in the future you're going to see, and I'm looking at Bob right now, a lot more. You're going to see the risk go from at the board away from the audit committee and the risk committee into some kind of tech committee or risk tech committee, and that's a good thing as well.
Excellent. Anyone else?
I would just say I agree with all of that, and I think one other factor that's happening quicker than we thought is perhaps the public-private cooperation element. There's particularly with the Department of Homeland Security, there's much more hands-on cooperation with the industry, not just in sharing threats, but also in advising on what technologies to procure, where to put their investments, where to find expertise. So I think that is another trend that's going along with this.
Yeah, and Dick, ultimately the SEC rules are forcing new stakeholders to this issue. The CFO and the CEO disclosure committees that they have responsibility for, and a broader group of executives to pay attention to this issue at a different level. So as you bring those stakeholders to the table, it can't help but shift the paradigm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, excellent points. And I to Chuck's point, I know from the public-private partnership work that I do in CISA, there's a great deal of interest in this, and I think people are realizing that you can't do this alone. You really need to have some level of collaboration to help make this successful. And one thing that Jim talked about with the paradigm shift, it seems like this isn't just a U.S. phenomenon. It seems like this is also something that we see happening worldwide. So I know the EU is also considering cybersecurity regulations for public companies. So how do the EU regulations compare to the SEC regulations? And I'm thinking EU, the CRA and the DORA at this point with those regulations. Thanks.
Yeah, Dick, we should be publishing some research on DORA in the near future from everything we do at Moody's is at Moody's Investor Service, the credit rating agency, is really from the perspective of credit. So, probability of default and losses given default. And maybe I should just mention, when it comes to critical infrastructure securities, which is our audience here, critical infrastructure securities default at a 4 times lower rate than non-financial corporates. And that study is in 2 different default studies that we could talk at another time. But it just goes to show the resiliency of the sector from our starting point. Now, DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act over in Europe, Europe tends to be a little bit ahead of the U.S. on most of this regulatory scrutiny. We see this in a number of different areas. But we like DORA in the sense that it's got a little bit of teeth in it, more so than just kind of guidelines and suggested helpful hints. It's mostly aimed at the banking sector and the financial sector. And so I think as that moves into place and gets into the communications and other parts of cloud providers and other standardization that'll come with that, there will be alignment between what's going on in Europe and what's going on in the US. There'll be alignment between DORA and the SEC regulations. And there has to be, because most of the big corporations are international, and so capital is kind of free to flow around, and so the harmonization of these different regulations is going to continue to take place. And so we see DORA as a good thing, even 1 step ahead of the SEC, maybe 2, and it's really good because it's really meant to enhance the resiliency. It's really coming at it from that angle of enhancing resiliency, as opposed to just disclosure, which is good. It's more of that rising tide philosophy that rises all ships.
Anyone else? No, excellent point, Jim. So one thing that I've done here recently is done a lot of work with the open source community. And when the EU CRA was being discussed, and it's now past a major milestone, there was a lot of concern that the EU CRA would basically shut down the open source work because of the requirements for cybersecurity. And so it seems like this need for harmonization that you're talking about, Jim, is really occurring in a couple of levels. I know that the U.S. has the IoT cybersecurity labeling initiative underway, and EU has a cybersecurity labeling effort underway. So all of those I would think need to be harmonized, as you mentioned. Any comments?
I just agree that Europe is ahead in a lot of areas, including privacy with GDPR and artificial intelligence. They already came out. We're following some of those directives. So I think there's a good reason to look at Europe. I think that we have many more stakeholders here in a different process that makes it difficult sometimes for legislation to go fast enough. And we don't have always the expertise inside on the Hill either. So I think some of the lessons we could take from Europe, particularly that digital is a global issue and it's not solely for the United States.
I'll give some kudos though to the US and our partners on critical infrastructure leadership when it comes to the nuances around keeping the lights on and things like that, and extending to some of the Five Eyes groups and things. I think they're doing a great job.
I think they're doing a great job. And that's separate, yeah.
Yeah, and what's really hard on even just and then there's the harmonization effort separately, right? With both the national cybersecurity strategy and then the harmonization effort within that, and I think it's in the first pillar. But there's a lack of prioritization once we have blanket, mandated authorities. And that's really difficult for critical infrastructure because prioritization is paramount. I mentioned that with mission critical systems, but that's also kind of the overlap between IT and OT is that we have to be able to prioritize things. We can't afford to do everything. We don't have the time and resources to do everything. And so I hope that the paradigm shift that Jim and others just underlined creates a world in which we can better prioritize regardless of what's mandated, right? In terms of reporting or building.
And Danielle, that's a great, and prioritization is an interesting thing. And there is the other side of that coin is, sovereigns are digging in a little bit on controlling their data. And so, this creates new opportunities for other types of businesses and asset classes like data centers and, where is your registry going to be held and things like that. And so we're very focused on that aspect as well, because, that gets into the uncertainty of where this is all going to end up. Yeah. But it'll be nice to see it lined up.
And a few other tangential kind of future-looking projects, right? Reshoring of certain components, bringing things back to the boundaries and the nation. And another one that I'll come back to, but I think that one's really important.
So we do have some audience questions. I'm going to take one now. I'm just going to try and read between the lines here and see if I get this right. So the question is, can a material event at a utility trigger a materiality event in a controls equipment manufacturing vendor? So, for example, if someone has discovers a vulnerability in their ICS environment, could that trigger a cyber incident that's material to a vendor who supplies that equipment?
Yes. I read that question a couple of times while we were chatting. Yes, the answer is yes. We have sort of seen this with InController, or it was also called Pipedream last year, the toolkit that was designed to target certain vendor systems. Luckily, that was discovered before it was active, but it wasn't exploited. So it was under development still, but in the systems. But yes, that does and can happen, and that's when we're talking specifically about vendor systems in the ICS world. You do similar prioritization exercises to IT, right? You say, what systems, assets, and devices does our business rely on most? What's the current threat landscape and vulnerability landscape for those systems? And which ones are exploitable in my environment? And if I have controls and policies built around them, are they doing enough? And if not, can I address it or can I compensate for it, right? Broadly speaking, that's the flow. There's a lot of contingencies in there. Legacy devices sometimes have a longer life cycle, so the compensating control becomes the only option in that Venn diagram to flow chart. But the short answer is yes, unfortunately.
Yeah, and the SEC, think about that. The SEC contemplates that, right? So there could be an incident that has third-party implications, and the incident may or may not be material to the first-order target entity. But then the downstream effects, second, tertiary effects, those that are affected by the incident have to make a materiality determination in the context of their reasonable investors. So the SEC expects there to be multiple disclosures of the same incident. And think about the communications, the risk communications in that process, right? Is the first order impact party, how are they communicating these issues out to the third party partners and their ecosystem? What if they don't think it's material? Will they communicate it out to the third party ecosystem? And what if we have 8,000 disclosures of the same incident from different contexts and different perspectives?
Yeah,
this is going to, quickly potentially spiral out of control.
I've asked a specific OEM how they think through this, right? And if there is an exploitable 0 day in the wild, right, in the field, fortunately or unfortunately, you would also have to have access to that component in the wild, in the field, at those 8,000 locations, right? So that kind of engagement with each target or each asset, not theoretically possible, not super likely. And so people have asked me before with the in-controller pipe dream incident, how was it discovered before it was exploited? Well, there's still a use it or lose it capacity with these 0 days. And that's why it's so important to go back to the very top of our discussion that we have discoverable controls in place, that it's not, oh my gosh, we have an incident today and we have to figure out whether it's material today. It's no, we've done the analysis. We know exactly what's material. We know how to discover things early, reduce the severity of the impacts, report things back to the vendors, et cetera. But, for better or for worse, there are multiple vendors. And I don't think we would see that type of widespread access because you want it, if you're going to exploit something, you're going to use it, and you may not have access to multiple systems at one time, right? You could. I think that's actually the movie plot of something popular on Netflix right now with Julia Roberts, but also some EMP in there, but not extremely likely. Yeah. So.
Chuck, did you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, well, I think what you're talking about is exactly right. I think supply chain issues are always a concern because in the past most large vendors have not been accountable for what's in their supply chain, and it's been a major target by adversaries to exploit that. So how the SEC looks at this, should you have responsibility as part of your framework and strategy to hold all your suppliers accountable to your standard, and if you're not and you're breached, are you liable? So I mean, there's a lot of sub issues that could come out of this. So I think it's early on, but we have to look at this.
Yeah, and I think we actually had an incident this year in Denmark where 22 energy companies were all impacted by the same vulnerability. And so you see these, the blast radius you see when these vulnerabilities occur within a common piece of software, like was the case in the firewalls in Denmark, you can see these coordinated attacks taking place. And that was a case where the incident occurred within the, the installed base, and then it was, and then the manufacturer was notified of this incursion. And so that became an event for them as well, right? So it certainly makes sense that these things will have a ripple effect, which I think is what I think Danielle was alluding to.
Agreed.
But again, I want to say you can't be perfect. So that goes for vendors too, right? It really is a partnership. We talk a lot about public-private partnerships, but also have that relationship with your vendor. Know what their disclosure policy looks like. Do they routinely respond and patch things? Are they certifying their products, right? Again, back to that leadership opportunity, it goes both ways. And criminals are creative, okay? And there's actually a case that I really like. It's very historic, and it's not necessarily criminal in the way we think of threat actors today, but Project Gunman was a supply chain attack on US typewriters as they went through customs in Russia when we used to have consulates there. One of the most creative supply chain hardware attacks in history, right? So as much as we do on the defensive side, the offensive side is always going to try to be creative, and that just means we need to build stronger partnerships. And I remembered earlier when I said the other thing happening tangential was bringing products back to shore. It's also numbers, hands on keyboards. We don't have the people to compete with the number of criminals or nation state actors, whatever you want to call them, threat actors, hacktivists, et cetera, we don't have a peer-to-peer number, right? So we need to build better partnerships, burden sharing, which is definitely part of the national cybersecurity strategy here, a lot more outreach. And so that paradigm shift needs to include everybody, right? No more gatekeeping for anyone in this field. Back to Jim, you know, speaking that same language is going to be so important for the survival of our critical infrastructure.
Well, this is such a unique opportunity for me. I having all of this expertise in one room. I have a million questions I could ask you guys because it's very rare that you have this level of expertise and from this broad an audience with across business domains and disciplines in one room. So this has been very helpful. So I know there are people out there who are wondering, you know, when they're all facing these SEC regulations, at least those that are subject to them. So where can people go for help in implementing processes and practices to satisfy these SEC regulations?
Yeah, Dick, that's pretty much all we do at DDN, and we were purpose-built to that effect. So, yeah, we're trying to build a collective that advances policies, practices, procedures on these issues, not just here in the States, but around the world too. So I invite everyone to engage and, you know, consider being a part of the collective.
Thank you, Bob. Anyone else?
I just said that there's a lot of events like this one that are sponsored by the government too, and I think it's really, you know, important for companies to attend those events to get to know, because those are the people making the decisions. And there may be specialized questions they may want to ask, or they may talk about what the future is. So, you know, the more face time you have with the people in power making these policies, the better.
I didn't come to push a product here, but as a solution vendor, we're you know, ready, willing, and able to help you. So Nozomi Networks has got a ton of resources, white papers, books, guides, mapping guides, everything you could think of.
Thank you, Danielle. Jim, would you like the last word on this?
Yeah, you know, so at Moody's, we've got two parts of the business. It's the credit rating agency where I am, and the Moody's Analytics, which is, you know, we're trying to be an integrated risk supplier, an assessment provider for anyone that needs to figure out how to do risks. So anybody could take a look at that. A lot of our cyber work is on the public side of the firewall that we have here, and we do that on purpose because, you know, we think this is very important stuff, and that we want to make sure that this is all available. It's not going to give you, you know, the stuff that Bob's going to give you or the stuff that Danielle's going to give you in terms of how to help out, but it's just data and information and insight that you might find useful. And
I'll put a little plug in here. I know that certifications are one of those things that people look for in the cybersecurity domain. And of course, we have CISSPs that are been popular for years. But Bob, I'm going to put a little plug in here for the work you're doing, because I think the new certification that's sort of indicative of this paradigm shift is something called QT. Is that correct? You call that a QT certification? Yeah,
the QTE, which is lifted and shifted from QFE back in the Sarbanes-Oxley days. And so that's an artifact that can demonstrate to leadership and to the boardroom community that we're taking a structured approach on these issues, right? We're not just a bunch of people kind of getting together and talking about stuff randomly. We're actually learning about these things in a structured fashion and to a standard, and we're solving these problems in a way that's more meaningful.
Okay, and I'm going to take one last look through the chat to see if we have any additional questions. Okay, so at this point, I think we've pretty much covered the main topics or things that people are interested in. So PJ, I am going to pass the baton back to you for you to take us to the final closure.
Thank you, Dick, and thank you, panelists. PJ, for those who may not be familiar, mind taking just a few words about Nozomi so folks will know a little bit about you?
Sure, I wanted to hold off the word from the sponsor till the end, but for those of you who have not heard of or not familiar with Nozomi Networks, it's an OT cybersecurity platform providing asset inventory, vulnerability scanning, continuous monitoring, and behavioral analytics for industrial environments, transportation, and connected facilities. And so I won't rattle off our products, but feel free to browse our website if you haven't heard of us. And we do have a very global footprint. I know this is a US based, typically audience, but I know there's probably people listening from all over the place. So we're interested to hear from you, to learn from you, and partner with you.
And I would be remiss in my duties if I didn't say right up front, thank you very much to Nozomi for supporting this program today, and thank you very much for EnergyCentral for hosting this. So thanks to everyone. PJ, it's all yours.
The best panelists, and I didn't recruit them, so thanks to you as well. Yeah.
Yeah, handpicked, DJ. Let me show you.
Awesome.
Just the best
Thank
of the
you
best.
So much. And just want to let the audience know, watch for a link to the replay as that becomes available probably early next week. And please also take a moment to fill out our survey that will pop up after the event today. We'd love to hear your feedback, and will help us to continue to produce quality events. From everyone here at EnergyCentral, thank you for joining. We look forward to seeing you on another upcoming Power Session soon. And this does conclude today's presentation.
Thanks, everybody. Great job. See ya. Take care, guys.